Then he pulled out a flash drive and made a backup copy of them. Backup copy, he said. Finally, he went to the bookshelf behind my chair and pulled out the 2 small cameras we had so carefully set up that morning. Once we were done with that, we both got in my car and headed back to the tavern so Lou could get his car. But when we got there, he surprised me by insisting that I follow him home. Ed's already made a big dinner, buddy. If you don't show up, she's going to be really pissed. I had planned to spend the night alone, but Lou didn't want to hear about it, so I reluctantly got behind the wheel of his car and followed him home. When we walked through the door, Edie came up to me, gave me a hug, and kissed my cheek without saying a word. I wasn't sure if it was friendship or pity, but either way, I appreciated it. I'm sure dinner was wonderful, but I don't remember much of it. In truth, I was just picking at the dishes Edie had prepared while Lou and Edie exchanged concerned glances. After that, they led me into their den, and Lou opened another bottle of wine. We sat and drank until Edie couldn't hold back any longer. I'm so angry and disappointed, Carol. I don't know what to say. She always seemed so sweet and loving. When did she turn into a selfish person? Success seems to have changed her, and now she thinks she can do whatever and be with whomever she wants. She turned sharply to Lou. Do whatever you can to help Tom. I don't like to take sides when friends divorce, but this is different. Carol is out of line, and we have to help Tom keep his daughter. She looked at her husband again with a piercing stare. And if you get hit on by one of those models or TV personalities you have to work with, you better say no, or I'll come after your balls with a butcher knife. Lou and I laughed at Ed's threat, but I wasn't sure if she was exaggerating just to prove a point. We continued talking and drinking into the night, and eventually, I collapsed on their couch. I vaguely remember Edie covering me with a blanket and patting my arm. The next thing I realized was the morning light coming through the picture window and the horrible taste in my mouth. Lou lent me a toothbrush and razor, and I did my best to make myself look half decent. By the time I was done, Edie had already made a big breakfast, and I sat down at the table with them. My appetite was a little better that morning. I guess my instinct for self-preservation kicked in. When I had finished and thanked them fervently for their kindness, Lou took my hand. Look, Tom, leave everything to me. I've got a lot to do this weekend, and I need to get started. All you have to do is pick up Susan and get out of here. I'll keep you posted all the way, Lou. I don't know what I would do if you weren't here, I said sincerely. With those words, I hugged him awkwardly and then headed home. I had one more thing to do, and I wasn't looking forward to it. When I got home, I checked our address book to get Ted and Missy Stevenson's number. When I called, the answer was, of course, Missy. Hi, Missy, this is Tom Bailey, Carol's husband. May I come over now and talk to you? Oh, hi, Tom. Yeah, I think that would be good. Come on in, she hesitated. We weren't that close, and I knew she was wondering why I wanted to see her. She'll find out soon enough, I thought grimly as I drove up to her house. I tried to think about what I would say. It wasn't easy to tell a woman that her husband was cheating on her, and the fact that I didn't know Missy very well made the situation even more awkward. But I felt I couldn't let what was going to happen next take her by surprise. Missy went to the University of Alabama with Carol and me. She was even in Carol's sorority. She seemed nice, but she was 2 years younger than us, so we didn't have many opportunities to socialize. I was surprised to learn that she married Ted. Frankly, she wasn't his type anyway. We socialized with each other at a few station events, but otherwise, Carol and I didn't socialize much with each other, except for Carol and Ted, I added bitterly to myself. When I arrived, she greeted me and offered me a drink. Just a glass of water with ice, please, I asked. I was afraid my mouth would go dry when I delivered my grim news. When she brought me a glass, I took a sip and then got down to my task. Missy, do you know where Ted is? I asked. Of course, she said. He's away at a TV convention. He'll be gone all week. Why do you ask, Tom? I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but Ted isn't at a televangelist convention. I found out that he and my wife are having an affair, and the two of them went to the coast to spend some intimate time together. Missy looked at me as if I'd punched her in the face. That can't be, she protested. I saw him off just last night. I could tell her thoughts were scattering by the minute as she went through her arguments. He loves me. He wouldn't betray me like that, another denial flashed by. Carol was like an older sister to me. She wouldn't hurt me like that. Finally, she broke down and just looked at me helplessly. Oh, Tom, are you sure? I grimly pulled out my cell phone and turned on the video. I had taken outside the green room as she watched their erotic scene. Her eyes began to redden, and then she started to cry. I didn't know what to do, so I sat down next to her, put my arm around her shoulders, and began gently stroking her back. I know, Missy, I know, I said. Suddenly, she looked up, anger flaring in her eyes. That seduced him, she shouted. If you had her under control. But she stopped mid-tirade when she saw my shocked face. Oh, Tom, I'm so sorry. I didn't think. You lost your wife too, didn't you? Missy's words brought my pain and loss back in full force, and the tears flowed again. We hugged each other helplessly, seeking comfort that wasn't there. Finally, we pulled away from each other. She wiped her face with the napkin she'd brought with the drinks and then asked me, "What are you going to do now?" I felt I had no choice but to explain the predicament Carol had put me in, especially with regard to Susan. Missy, who had no children, realized at once the influence Carol had over me and grasped my hand sympathetically. "Oh, Tom, I never would have believed she could be so cruel and cold," she said. Then she asked me again, "What are you going to do, Missy?" "I'm definitely going to file for divorce, but there are still a few things I need to do so I don't lose Susan. It's probably best if you don't know what those things are in case someone asks you about it later." "You're not going to do anything illegal, are you?" she gasped. "No, but if I succeed, both she and Ted will wish they'd never decided to cheat on us." I tried to smile slightly to reassure her, but I doubt it was convincing. "What about you?" I asked. "Do you think you two can rebuild your marriage after what you just showed me? After I found out this has been going on for a hell of a long time? After I found out that he and that woman are going to spend a week together? There's no way I can stay with him and hold myself together again. In that case, you might want to use the lawyer I contacted unless you already have someone you trust," I suggested. She gave me a weak smile. "No, I don't know who to turn to. I didn't plan on needing a lawyer. If you use my lawyer, it could save you money. At least he'll have all the evidence I have." I handed her the piece of paper I had prepared with my attorney's name, address, and phone number. "If you contact him on Monday and let him know we're on the same page, he can process your paperwork at the same time as mine." She took the information and nodded. "Missy, now I have a huge favor to ask of you." "What is it?" she asked nervously. "All I ask is that you don't say anything to anyone, not your family, not your closest friend, not anyone, until you hear from me," I said, looking directly at her. "If you tell anyone, it could cost me the chance to keep Susan." She looked at me very solemnly, and I felt that she understood everything. "I won't say a word, Tom. It will be hard to act as if nothing has happened, but I promise." I thanked her, stood up, and headed for the door. "What are you going to do now, Tom?" she asked. I smiled grimly at her and said, "I'm going to pick up my daughter and take her out of town until all this settles down." She wished me luck, and I wished her the same. We both are going to need it, I thought. From there, I drove to Mrs. Alsop's house. When I arrived, she must have warned Susan of my arrival because my little girl met me at the door and jumped into my arms. "Did you have a good time, honey?" I asked. "Oh yes, Daddy. I had a sleepover, and we had pancakes for breakfast." "And then I played with dolls," Susan replied, holding Susan in my arms. I thanked Mrs. Alsop for staying with Susan and reminded her that Susan would not be coming to her house next week. Mrs. Alsop looked at me shrewdly and asked, "Is everything all right, Tom?" I looked at Susan and then back at Mrs. Alsop. I hope so, was all I said. She nodded and leaned over to kiss Susan's cheek. You take good care of that girl. She's like family to me, and Tom, I'll be praying for you. Thank you, Mrs. Alsop. It means a lot to me. With those words, I carried Susan to the car and put her in the car seat in the back seat. When we got home, Susan started looking for her mother. Where's Mommy? She asked me when she couldn't find her. I felt my throat constrict as I told her Mom had to go on a trip, but you know what? You and I are going on a trip too. Where are we going, Daddy? She asked excitedly. We're going to Grandma and Grandpa's farm, I told her. She squealed and started dancing. Susan adored my parents and loved to watch the animals on their small farm in rural Alabama. Can we see the ducks and the little pigs? She asked. Sure, honey, I told her, and the sooner we get started, the sooner we can see them. Then I grabbed the bag I had already packed for her and my own suitcase, and we headed out to the car. I briefly considered leaving Carol a note about where we would be, but decided against it. She hasn't been thinking much of me lately. Why should I think about her? The drive to Mom and Dad's farm took a little over an hour, and Susan slept most of the way. But when we turned onto a rough gravel road, she woke up and started pointing at the horses and cows she could see through the car windows. When we pulled up to the house, Mom and Dad came out to greet us. When we unbuckled Susan, she rushed into Grandma's arms and demanded to go see the farm animals. Mom took her hand and led her to the barn, but not before I gave her a concerned look. I took my bag, Dad took Susan's bag, and we went into the house to get settled into my old bedroom. After that, Dad brought me into the kitchen and offered me a glass of fruit tea. It was already sweetened, and its flavor reminded me of my childhood. It seemed like those days were a long time ago. Okay, Tom, what's going on between you and Carol? Asked Dad bluntly. He'd never been one for small talk, and I could see the worry in his eyes. Let's take a walk, Daddy, and I'll tell you all about it. I had been waiting for this conversation ever since I called them and asked if we could come and stay for a week. They loved Carol and considered her the daughter they never had. I wasn't sure how it would affect them. As we walked along the fence, I began to tell him the whole sordid story. He was silent most of the time, but I could see the pain in his eyes when he looked at me. Several times, he gasped at what I had to tell him. Finally, I finished. There were tears in his eyes. I just can't believe Carol could do this. She's always been so good to your mom and me, and such a good mother to Susan. How could she become so callous and selfish? He turned and looked at me carefully. You know, I've never doubted you, Tom, but could this be some kind of misunderstanding or a joke? I realized he was in denial and grasping at straws, but it was still a little uncomfortable. Then I thought, if I were him, I'd have to ask the same questions. Hell, I still have a hard time believing it myself. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I queued up the video I had taken in the green room and held it out to him. Watch this, Dad. When he took the phone, I reached over and pressed the arrow to start the video playing. He muttered to himself in a half-whisper, I can't make out almost anything. Oh my God. I saw the picture come into focus. Carol's nearly naked body broke free from Ted Stevenson's embrace and began sliding down his torso, reaching for his belt, unbuckling it, and then unzipping his pants. I took the phone from him, and he stood there helplessly, his shoulders slumped and his face tense. Then he grabbed me and put me in a tight hug. Oh, son, I'm so sorry. It hurts me so much to see this. I can't even imagine how you felt. We stood like that for a few more minutes, and then we turned and started walking back to the house in silence. He kept his hand on my shoulder the whole way. As we approached the house, I turned to him and asked, Dad, can you tell Mom? I don't think I can do that. He nodded solemnly. I'll do it, he said. Mom and Susan were in the kitchen having a snack when we came back. Mom looked at Dad, and when she saw his face, she was scared. She started to speak, but Dad raised his hand to stop her. Why don't you take Susan to the pond so she can see all the little ducklings?" Hearing this, Susan jumped up and started tugging on my arm. "Let's go see the ducks, Daddy." "Can we go?" I nodded gratefully to Dad and led Susan toward the pond. When we got back to the house, I saw that Mom had been crying. She wiped her eyes with a towel as we entered the house, then came over and hugged me tightly. "I love you, Tom. Dad and I will be there for you no matter what happens." "Thanks, Mom." I managed to whisper, looking over her shoulder. I saw Dad, and said, "Thank you, Dad. That means so much to me." We stood like that for a long time, and the silence was clearly beginning to bother Susan, who couldn't understand what was wrong. Then, I turned to her and said, "Okay, Susan, let's go unpack. Then we need to wash up and get ready for dinner." That broke the spell, and she took my hand, beginning to walk nimbly back to our room, leading me behind her. I told myself that I would never lose my daughter, no matter what. The next day was Sunday, and we all went to the old Baptist church that Mom and Dad had attended for many years. As they say in the village, I had been an apostate for a long time, but I was glad to be in church again, to hear the familiar words and sing the old hymns. In the evening, I got a call from Lou. He brought me up to speed and told me all about what he had been doing that weekend. As I listened to him, I realized that, no matter what happened, I was lucky to have a good friend like Lou, and that I would be indebted to him for a long time to come. I tried to tell him this, but I was uncomfortable expressing my emotions in the awkward way that men do in such matters. He brushed it off. "You would have done it for me." But he understood what I wanted to say, and I knew it then. His tone changed. "Okay, Tom. So far, this has all been just fun. Are you ready to put it into action? Once we get started, there's no turning back." I did not answer him at once, but paused to consider what we were about to do. There was no guarantee of success. In fact, even if we succeeded, it could still end badly for me. And if the whole thing blew up in my face, things could get ugly very quickly. I might very well have to work on my parents' farm. But then I thought about everything that had happened in the last 2 weeks. Through no fault of my own, Carol had humiliated me, put me in a position I couldn't bear. Even if I decided to subject myself to her desires, there was no guarantee that the situation wouldn't come to light or happen again. And if it did, what would Susan think of me when she was old enough to understand? I didn't want to be such a model of a father to her. No, I thought, Carol had me cornered, and I had no choice but to fight back. And by God, that's exactly what I'm going to do. "Lou," I said, "let's do it." He must have realized what I was thinking just now because he didn't say anything while I sat there pondering. But when I told him I was ready, he simply replied, "If anything, E thinks you're doing the right thing." That kind of cheered me up. Now he was all business. "Do you have access to a computer?" I laughed and said, "My ancestors may live on a farm, but they don't live in the 1800s. "Okay, then, I'll call you with information on where to find him tomorrow." "Why don't you just email me the link?" said I. "I can easily log into my email from here." "No," he said, "I don't want anyone to know about this. Just wait for my call tomorrow." That was goodbye, and I went to make sure Susan was sound asleep in her new bed. Keeping an eye on her had become my most important job. Lou called me mid-morning Monday. "When you get a chance to get some privacy at your computer, go to YouTube and type WXY into the search engine," he told me. "You'll find it. After you watch it, get back to me and tell me what you think." Mom and Dad took Susan out for a walk, so the timing was perfect. I went to the website and started searching. There were a bunch of videos, but one called WXY co-host Carol Martin shares her personal philosophy on love and marriage caught my eye. When I pressed it, the familiar theme music for the 6 o'clock news came pouring out of the speakers, accompanied by the standard opening number that WXY used every weeknight. But as the camera zoomed in on Carol, her voice faded out, and a voiceover came on. Popular news co-host Carol Martin of WXY was recently interviewed by WXY about her views on love and marriage. The screen switched to another image of Carol, and I heard her say, "Marriage is an institution that has been around as long as human society, but today it is under siege like never before." I recognized those lines immediately. It was the beginning of a soft news series WXY was running about the rising divorce rate across the country. But instead of continuing the series, which actually aired a few months ago, the voiceover came back. "What are your views on the sanctity of marriage, Carol?" Suddenly, the scene shifted to our den where Carol stood and spoke. Wedding vows were written for another time and place. No one believes all that nonsense anymore. The scene froze, and the voiceover came on again. "What about fidelity and constancy to your husband? What do you think about that, Carol?" Carol's image on the screen spoke again. "If I want to leave and hoot Ted Stevenson, I'll do it. That's what I want to do." Ted Stevenson's image flashed on the screen, leaving the viewer in no doubt as to who Carol was talking about. The invisible announcer returned. "What about the public's opinion? Do you think most of the people of Birmingham who watch your news program would agree with you?" Carol spoke again. "I don't care what my fans think. They're just a bunch of boobs and redneck dorks." The announcer smoothly filled the sudden silence. "That's certainly a controversial point of view, Carol. Aren't you concerned about how it might affect public opinion?" Carol's image on the screen quickly prompted an answer. "Look, in 6 months to a year, I'll leave this provincial town and get a job in a real city where the streets don't turn down at night. In the meantime, what people here think means nothing to me." Without a shadow of irony or judgment, the unseen voice continued. "So, you intend to engage in a sexual relationship with your fellow anchor, Ted Stevenson?" Carol's response was unequivocal. "I've already told you that I'm going to go off and have my little affair with Ted Stevenson, and there's nothing you can do about it." But this time, instead of a scene of Carol talking to me in our room, her voice came through on a video I was shooting on my phone in the green room. And as with my father, the scene went from two figures entwined in the darkness to a clear image of a barely clothed Carol dropping to her knees and beginning to undress the unmistakable figure of Ted Stevenson. The stage froze on the erotic scenes, and the voiceover returned for the last time. Now Birmingham viewers were left with only one question: where are Carol and Ted this week? Then the WXY news theme came on the screen, filled with a view of the newsroom with empty chairs, and the video faded out. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a strange mixture of triumph and sadness. I grabbed my cell phone and called Lou. Apparently, he recognized my number because he said in response to the call, "Well, what do you think?" "My God, Lou, you're a genius. This is going to be brutal. This video will cut her career open like a carving knife on a Thanksgiving turkey." "Not bad, eh?" "I have to admit, I'm proud of it," he said cheerfully. I began to feel a twinge of guilt, remembering what I had just seen. "Do you think we were too rough on her?" I said vehemently. "Did she or did she not say all these things to your face?" "Yes," I replied. "But no buts," he cut in. "She's turned into a selfish monster, and we need to show that to the rest of the world." Then his tone changed. "Look, Tom, you're a good guy at heart. I think in many cases you'd rather suffer yourself than make someone else suffer. But if you don't, it won't be you who suffers, but Susan. She's grown up with Carol as her role model. You don't want that, do you?" I swallowed hard. "You're right, Lou. There really is no choice here. Thanks for helping me not to be confused." "So," I said, "what do we do next? Do we send out mass emails with a link to the video or what? The beauty of the virus is that you don't have to do anything special to spread it. Once there is a source of infection, the flu virus spreads unaided, and very soon there is an epidemic. This video is our source of contagion. I may drop a hint to a couple of people who like to gossip, but beyond that, it will spread on its own. You just have to be patient, okay? Lou, you're the expert on these things. Just keep me informed for the next few days." Susan and I had a wonderful time visiting Mom and Dad. Susan had been to the farm before, but only for a day or two. Now that we had a whole week at our disposal, Dad and I wanted to give her a real sense of how the farm worked, and Susan began to learn where our food came from. At the same time, Mom took Susan into the kitchen and introduced her to cooking. Our food at home was more like open the package and heat the contents than real cooking. Mom cooked almost everything from scratch, and Susan loved to stand on the stool next to her and help add ingredients and stir them in large bowls. All in all, it was a wonderful week for Susan, during which she was exposed to many things she would not have encountered in our city life. Meanwhile, Lou called every day to keep me updated on how the snowball was starting to roll down the mountain straight at Susan. On Tuesday, he even chuckled when he informed me that Edie had learned about the video from a woman she worked with. On Wednesday, the video became a topic of discussion at the weekly Kiwanis meeting Lou attended. He swore he wasn't the only one who brought it up. In Thursday morning's paper, a local media columnist devoted a few short lines in her column to the video, mentioning it in vague terms. At the end, she wrote the following, and the question on the minds of all of Birmingham this week is, where are Carol and Ted? When he called me Thursday afternoon, Lou couldn't contain the glee in his voice. I talked to our media officer, who handles WXY. He said the whole station is in a panic. They're starting to get calls from other news outlets trying to interview Carol and Ted about the video. The people at WXY don't know what to do. Apparently, Don Sanchez is gone for a few days this week too, and no one knows where he is or how to contact him. On Friday, Lou directed me to an article on the media blog, Gawker.com. Gawker.com it reported on the furor 2 WXY news anchors had caused in Birmingham and linked to a YouTube video. The article ended with a prediction that heads might roll. I called my attorney that morning and told him to file for divorce. I also arranged with him to have Carol served on Saturday at the country house in Gulf Shores, where she and Ted were spending time. It would cost me some money, but I figured it would be worth it. My hunch was more of a bet, uncertainty, because I knew what Lou's next move would be. I also called Missy to let her know that I was filing for divorce and wanted Carol to be served with the summons on Saturday. I asked her if she wanted Ted to file at the same time. No, she replied calmly. I plan to do it myself when he finally gets home. I wished her luck. Other local Birmingham TV stations were insanely jealous of WXY's success. They had learned of the gossip earlier in the week and smelled blood in the water when they viewed the video online. The only problem was how to play the story. Lou gave them the answer. He informed the news producer at the second highest rated channel that I was filing for divorce. This tidbit represented a real news event that they could use at their discretion without having to report what was essentially gossip. Then my attorney went on the sly. When the TV station reporter called to confirm the filing, the lawyer told her that the papers would be served on Saturday and managed to reveal the location where it would take place. Suddenly, the hounds were up in arms. The news director decided the story was too savory to ignore and decided to go full force. The station contacted the court server assigned to serve Carol, and they agreed to coordinate. Once everything was settled, the station manager authorized sending a video crew and lead reporter to Gulf Shores on Saturday. Lou called me Saturday morning with more news. Apparently, Don Sanchez had finally been contacted. He had cut his vacation short and was trying to make arrangements to get back to Birmingham as soon as possible. Lou's contact at WXY told him that everyone at the station was terrified, no one knew what was going to happen. Lou also advised me to be sure to watch the evening news on a competitor station. I think you'll find it interesting, he said with sarcastic understatement. Saturday is usually a slow news day, so TV stations are often grasping at straws for content. Apparently, that was the case that Saturday because the news about Carol and Ted was the top story. The co-host, a somewhat smarmy type, went on the air with a picture of Carol and Ted behind him. It was a shot of a billboard I had seen from my office window the week before. All this week, many Birmingham residents have been concerned about the question, where are Carol Martin and Ted Stevenson of WXY? In an exclusive piece today, we managed to find them in Gulf Shores, where they have been hiding all week. The scene switched to footage of the station's lead reporter, Hilda O'Reilly, a red-haired woman with a sharp voice, walking down the beach toward a couple sunbathing on the sand. It was Carol and Ted, of course. Neither of them heard the reporter, cameraman, and microphone operator until Hilda walked up to them and started asking loudly, "Carol Martin, Ted Stevenson, what can you tell us about your relationship and the stories that are going around in Birmingham?" Carol let out a small exclamation of surprise and turned around to see who was talking to her. When she did, it was clear to the audience that she was sunbathing topless. When she saw the small crowd and the video camera, she cried out again and hastily covered her breasts, which of course were blurred on the TV screen to meet FCC standards. She turned away to match her bra to her bikini, and as she bent over to put it on, she discovered that her bikini bottoms were thongs. The camera then turned to Ted Stevenson, who was desperately trying to reach for his beach towel to cover the tiny Speedo swimsuit. After cleaning herself up, Carol turned angrily to the red-haired reporter and shouted, "Hilda, what are you doing here? Why are you intruding on us like this?" Hilda didn't look the least bit embarrassed. "What do you have to say about the video that's all over the internet?" she asked. "What video?" asked Carol, confusedly. "The one where you told all the rednecks in Birmingham that you came here to have an affair with Ted Stevenson," Hilda replied coldly. Carol began to sputter, and Ted tried to intervene and divert attention away from her. But just at that moment, the unlikely appearance of a man in a suit and tie on the beach caused everyone to pause. Approaching Carol, he asked in a loud voice, "Are you Carol Bailey Martin?" Reflexively, Carol answered, "Yes." "Then, Miss Martin," he said, handing her the envelope, "you have received notice. Your husband has also instructed me to inform you that the locks on your house have been changed, and you are no longer welcome there." With those words, he turned quietly on his heels and strode away from the beach. For a moment, Carol was stunned. Then anger flashed in her eyes, and she screamed, "That son of a..." Being a television professional, Ted realized the cameras were still rolling and grabbed Carol, warning her in a low voice not to say anything else. He grabbed her arm and half led, half pulled her toward the resort. The camera focused on her well-glistening buttocks as she angrily staggered away. The local announcer reappeared on the screen. "This is it. Carol Martin and Ted Stevenson, who have been missing all week, it turns out, were sharing a room at the posh Gulf Shores resort. And most interestingly, Carol's husband sued her for divorce and kicked her out of the house. We tried to contact her husband, but couldn't get a comment. They couldn't contact me because Susan and I were safe at my parents' farm, and I was going to stay there for the rest of the week. Although that meant I was safe from prying reporters for the moment, the only means of keeping up to date was Lulu learned from his interlocutor on another Birmingham TV station that Carol had foolishly not believed the bait when he told her I had changed the locks and had asked Ted to take her to the house. It was a double mistake because not only did her key no longer work in the door, but the TV station had stationed a camera crew to watch the house, and her embarrassment and frustration were caught on camera. It got worse the next time she and Ted drove to his house. Not thinking about the consequences, Missy met him at the door with a packet of divorce papers and told Ted not to come back. A camera crew was also there, and Ted's humiliation was included in a news story for all to see. In desperation, they rushed around trying to lose the tail of reporters and ended up spending the night in a motel on Interstate 65 halfway to Tennessee. For the next chapter of the story, Lou had to turn to our media manager, who in turn got the information from his interlocutor at WXY. Don Sanchez, WXY's news director, finally got back to Birmingham on Saturday afternoon and tried unsuccessfully to contact Carol and Ted. They were, of course, on their way back from Gulf Shores with their phones turned off to avoid calls from other reporters. Don couldn't even leave a message. Carol and Ted's mailbox was overloaded with voicemail. The result of all this was a very angry news director. His composure didn't improve when someone showed him a tape of a competing network's exclusive Saturday night newscast. It wasn't until Sunday afternoon that Ted had the good sense to call the office, at which point Don sharply ordered the two co-hosts to report to the studio immediately. The two of them got back into Ted's car and went straight to the WXY studio. When they arrived, they discovered that the competing station's remote broadcasting van was parked across the street, so they had to drive to the back of the building and sneak to the service elevator. With this little maneuver, they burst unannounced into a meeting Don was having with the rest of the staff. Apparently, the yelling started immediately, with Don berating the couple for their stupid, promiscuous behavior and Carol and Ted trying to defend themselves. Finally, Don had had enough. In front of the entire group, he told Carol and Ted that they were fired. "What?" screamed Carol. "You can't do that. We have a contract." Don went into executive mode and replied very coldly, "If you check those contracts, you'll see that there's a morals clause requiring you to behave according to the norms of society. What we do in private is nobody's business." Carol snapped back. Don, who was a practicing Catholic, stood up and leaned across his desk toward her. "When I was at Mass at the cathedral this morning, the priest spoke about the sanctity of marriage and the sin of adultery. He didn't mention you two by name, but he spoke of the bad examples set by some public figures in our town." Carol recoiled at the thought of being the subject of local sermons, but Ted was still indignant and hastened to continue, "But nobody knows about us or cares, for that matter." Now, Don was getting sarcastic. "Obviously you didn't see the news on the other news stations last night. I suggest you get a copy and watch it. But there's no need to wait. Just look out the window." With those words, he walked over to the window behind his desk and pulled back the curtain. Across the street was one of the billboards featuring the now infamous co-hosts. Carol took a quick glance at the sign, then took a double breath and looked more closely. "Oh my God," she gasped. The sign had been defaced by a vandal who had the nerve to use a can of spray paint. He hadn't done anything special, just erased some of the text. But now, the sign proudly read, "Birmingham's choice for the 6 o'clock news is." Don lowered the curtain and turned to the silent couple again. In an official tone, he said, "Your behavior has dishonored this station and caused irreparable damage to our ratings and reputation. I have no choice but to take you off the air immediately and terminate your contracts." He paused, then said bitterly, "Have you ever seen the original Frankenstein?" Confused by the change of subject, both nodded uncertainly. "You are a monster, and the people of Birmingham are an angry mob. If I were you, I'd get out of town as soon as possible. I was very nervous as Susan and I drove back to Birmingham on Sunday evening. I had deliberately left late, hoping to avoid any confrontation with Carol or the media. As a result, I heard the news of Carol and Ted's dismissal on the Sunday evening news. But when I pulled up to our garage, it appeared that, having scored a famous victory, the opposing news teams had decided to leave the battlefield. The next morning, the Birmingham News broke a new scandal involving a city politician who was accused of embezzling public funds. The story pushed Ted and Carol to the back pages and kicked off a new witch hunt. Apparently, no one cared about the angry husband's reaction anymore. That morning, I took Susan to Mrs. Alsop's house. When I arrived, Mrs. Alsop met me at the door and gave Susan a protective hug. "Come on in, honey," she told her. "My children have missed you. They want to play." As Susan ran off to her little friends, Mrs. Alsop turned to me with a sympathetic look. "I was so sad to hear about everything that happened, Tom. I hope you and Susan are doing well." I thanked her for her sympathy, but I didn't have an answer for how things would work out for us. I thought it was telling that she didn't include Carol in her expressions. When I got to the office, everyone was friendly, but I felt like they were avoiding me. It was as if I had a terminal illness and no one knew what to say. The exception, of course, was Lou. He hugged me, and I hugged him back just as tightly. "You're a genius," I told him. "Well," he said, "it worked out better than we could have hoped. The only bad thing is that we'll never be able to tell anyone what we did." "That's good," I replied. "I know this is going to backfire on me, and I'm ready for it. Carol has probably already guessed by now that I must be the source of this video and is going to come after me." As it turned out, I had been too pessimistic in my expectations. My lawyer called me at the end of the week and informed me that Carol had decided not to contest the divorce. But why? I asked. She'd already told me what she was going to do if I applied, he said. And what happened? I spoke with Carol's attorney, and she told me the rest of the story. He said Carol wanted to countersue for divorce and sue you for invasion of privacy, but her attorney talked her out of it. She noted that there are legal questions about whether a person can legally record their spouse's conversation. These issues become even more confusing when one spouse is a TV host, a very public figure. Anyway, she told Carol that her lawsuit may have to go all the way to the Supreme Court before it is finally resolved. She also reminded Carol that she's not very popular these days, so she would have a hard time finding sympathetic jurors to hear her case. What about Susan? I asked. Carol swore she'd try to take her away from me. My lawyer snorted, Tom, your soon-to-be ex-wife is unemployed. Her chances of resuming her career, not only in Birmingham but in the entire state of Alabama, are absolutely zero. What's more, I don't think she'll be able to get a job at a broadcasting company anywhere in the Southeast after the publicity she's gotten. She's now a poster child for unfaithful wives with a reputation for immorality, no steady job, and no prospects in the entire region. What kind of judge can award her custody of a small child? The bottom line is that Carol is leaving town as fast as she can. You'll still have to split the proceeds of the house when it's sold, which could be any time between now and when Susan turns 18. Carol will still have visitation rights with the children on holidays and birthdays, but she's giving up custody in your favor because she really has no hope of getting anything else. The only thing she wants is to be allowed to go into the house and get her personal belongings before she leaves town. One more thing, Tom, he continued. She'd like to be able to talk to you when she comes to your house. If she signs the papers on those terms, I think I can talk to her before she leaves town. I told him we agreed that would happen at the end of the week, so it was done. I really did get everything I wanted. No, that's not true. What I really wanted was to get my life and my family back to the way they were before this whole terrible mess happened. But that was just wishful thinking. Once the avalanche starts coming down, nothing can stop it. But at least I had my daughter, and that was the only thing that mattered to me. The next night, Lou, Edie, and I celebrated over dinner. Susan had come too, and now she was sleeping in one of their beds while the adults continued the party. It wasn't really a party, just an opportunity for the three of us to reflect on all that had happened. I brought a bottle of the most expensive champagne I could find to toast my friends and thank them for their loyalty. Edie, in turn, raised her glass to the two of us. Guys, she said, when I heard about your scheme, I thought you were crazy. I thought everything would blow up in your faces, and we'd have a big mess. The only thing that kept me from objecting was that you, she saluted me, were fighting for your little girl and had nowhere else to turn. And you, my loving husband, were so convinced you could handle it. So thank you both for fighting when you had to and winning despite the long odds. There, Lou and I agreed in unison. I felt I had to do one more thing before this whole dastardly scheme could be considered over, check on Missy Stevenson. If anyone was an innocent bystander, it was her. But I knew she was suffering just as much, if not more, than everyone else involved, and I felt a little guilty for dragging her into the story, even though I had no choice, and even though the real culprit was Ted. But at least I'd had a chance to make up my mind. Missy hadn't expected it. I called to ask if I could come over, and she invited me to lunch, so I figured she didn't hold too much of a grudge against me. We met at a quiet neighborhood restaurant, and after the waiter took our orders, I asked how she was doing. I'm afraid not very much, Tom, she replied. I still can't believe all this has happened. One day, I'm happily married to a handsome, successful TV host, and the next day, I'm divorcing a bastard who lied, cheated, and humiliated me in front of the whole town. I know, Missy, I comforted her. This is all so unbelievable. I feel like I'm caught up in a bad soap opera on daytime television. She wanted to know what was going on with Carol and me, so I told her the results of our divorce. Great, she said vindicatively. She got what she deserved. What about Ted? I asked. What's going on with you two? That coward, she replied bitterly. He didn't have the courage or the courtesy to face me. He just left town, telling his lawyer to give me whatever I wanted. I have no idea where he went, nor do I care, except of course that I keep waking up at night and reaching for him before I remember what happened. She pulled out a handkerchief and blotted her eyes. Are you going to be okay financially? I asked. Yes and no, she said. He left me a house, but it's too big for me to live in by myself. Plus, we have a big mortgage and no real funds, so I don't think I can afford to support him. Ted has to pay me alimony, but frankly, I don't count on it. The only way he'll be able to pay is if he finds a new job, and my friends have warned me that's not going to be easy, she sighed. Anyway, I think the smartest thing for me to do is to move in with my folks for a while, try to get a job, and start to rebuild my life. She paused. That's not how my life was supposed to turn out, she said sadly. I felt terribly sorry for her. She was a sweet girl who didn't deserve anything like this. I begged her to stay in touch and let me know where she was. I really liked Missy, and I hoped she could pull through. She deserved it. The only thing left was Carol's visit, and I wasn't looking forward to it. The anger and resentment I'd felt earlier had subsided with the success of our viral video campaign. I felt like I had at least partially regained my manhood, and I no longer needed to fight with her or gloat over my victory. As a result, I decided to do something nice for Carol. I arranged for Susan to be with me when Carol's time came. As Carol got out of the SUV she had rented to move her clothes and other personal belongings, I saw the frown on her face. But when I opened the door and let Susan run up to her, the frown disappeared, turning into a smile and happy tears as Susan threw herself around her mother's neck and hugged her desperately. Carol looked up at me and whispered, "Thank you." They entered the house, and Carol began to play with Susan for quite some time. Officially, the visit was supposed to last only an hour, but I had mentally thrown that time out the window when I decided to invite Susan. When Susan had exhausted the list of things she wanted to show and tell her mother, Carol suggested she go up to her room and play. "I'll be up in a bit, baby." "Daddy and I need to talk first," Carol said. As soon as Susan left, Carol turned to me with some annoyance and said, "Thank you for that. I really didn't expect you to let me see her." I just nodded. Carol's mood changed noticeably. "I can't believe you would do this to me. You used a private conversation between the two of us to destroy me, to make me the laughingstock of the entire town. How could you do that?" I sighed. "Carol, I don't want to fight with you anymore." "We're both not going to win anything," I said. "Easy for you to say," she replied. "You're a winner. You cost me my job, my family, and my future, all to protect your fragile ego." "Carol, I said I wasn't going to fight with you, and I meant it. I just want you to think about one thing. None of this would have happened if you hadn't decided to satisfy your own desires regardless of anyone or anything else. Everything that happened, you brought it on yourself." Carol opened her mouth to answer, but at that moment, Susan called out to her, asking when she was going upstairs. Carol looked at me for a moment, then turned on her heel and walked upstairs to her daughter. After playing in Susan's room for a while, Carol took her daughter into our bedroom and started packing up her things while continuing to talk to Susan. I could hear their happy chatter from downstairs. Finally, Carol came back downstairs, dragging her suitcases behind her with Susan trailing behind. Carol put the bags in place and then turned and knelt in front of her daughter, taking Susan by the shoulders. "Mom will have to leave. I'll be living in another state and won't be able to see you every day, but I promise I'll see you every chance I get, and we can talk on the phone and videotape each other for as long as you want." Susan immediately cried out earnestly, "No, Mommy. I don't want you to go." The girl threw her arms around her mother's neck and clung to her as if she were the only life raft in the ocean. Carol lifted her into her arms and stood, hugging her tightly, stroking her back and trying to reassure her. "It's okay, doll. I'll see you soon, and you'll tell me about what you've been doing, and we'll have such a good time," she spoke as she walked over to me and held out Susan. "Now, you're going to be a good girl and do whatever your daddy tells you to do. I love you, Susan. Don't ever forget that." Then she turned, picked up her suitcases, and walked briskly to the door. I could see tears streaming down her face, but she didn't let herself look back. Instead, she walked straight to her car, loaded her suitcases into the back seat, and with a quick wave of her hand, drove away. I hugged my sobbing daughter, and tears ran down my cheeks. I realized with surprise that they were caused not only by the loss of my daughter, but also by my loss. My little girl was losing her mother, and I was losing my wife. Finally, I lowered Susan to the ground. "Listen," I said. "I have an idea." "What, Daddy?" she asked, with tears in her eyes. "Why don't we go to the park and see if the ducks are there? And after we do that, maybe we can find an ice cream man and buy an ice cream cone. Would you like some?" "Oh yes," she answered immediately. "And we can feed the cones to the ducks, can't we, Daddy?" "Of course we can," I replied. I was greatly relieved to be able to distract Susan from her sadness. I knew there would be many more times she would miss her mom and the female presence in our home, but I hoped what I'd heard was true. Young children are more resilient and adapt to change more quickly than older children. And I thought, regretfully, I hoped I could adapt too. The next week, I learned that I would have to adapt even more than I had expected. Late one night, the head of the agency called me into his office. "Tom," he began, "you've done a tremendous job for us, and we sincerely appreciate your contribution to the success of the agency. I was just waiting for the but that I knew was coming. I didn't think I was going to like the direction it was taking. But this whole thing with your wife has left an odor that spreads all around. Clients ask if you're Carol's husband, and it has an impact on them, even when I tell them your status. Not surprisingly, our relationship with WXY is also quite strained, and after all, they are a key media outlet for us. Are you firing me?" I asked bluntly. I was getting annoyed and didn't want to listen to 15 minutes of entreaties. "Absolutely not," he said firmly. "But I've talked to the other supervisors, and we think it's best for you and the agency if you decide to seek employment elsewhere." "How much time do I have?" I snapped back at him. "There's no deadline," he assured me. "Take as much as you need. And listen, Tom, I'll be happy to give you a glowing letter of recommendation. I hope it will make it easier for you to find one quickly." I didn't like it. It wasn't fair. But I realized that there was no point in burning bridges behind me, so I shook his hand, assured him that I understood everything, and would start the search immediately. I thanked him for the offer of approval. Then I went back to my office. On my way out, I walked into Lou's office and closed the door. "What's up, buddy?" he asked. "I just got fired," I told him. "I guess all that heat we brought downstairs got too hot for the supervisors here." Then I told him about my conversation with the supervisor. "This is utter nonsense," he bellowed. "I'm going over there, and I'm going to tell him what I think. They can't do that to you, especially after everything you've been through." I took him by the shoulders and guided him back to the swivel chair. "You're not going to do anything but keep quiet. I don't like being thrown overboard, but I knew it was fraught when I started. I won't let you get hurt. You've done too much for me already." I could see he wasn't happy, but he started to calm down and let me talk him out of the confrontation. We ended the conversation with me promising him to come over for dinner on Saturday. I told him I would come if I could bring a friend, and he looked shocked until I explained that she was 4 years old. Then I went back to my office and started updating my resume. As I worked, I shook my head regretfully. It looked like Missy wasn't the only party affected. I had several contacts at other agencies in the Birmingham area, and I immediately started calling them. However, after talking to a few of them, I realized that Carol and Ted's affair had left me as damaged goods in the area. Everyone liked me personally, but no one wanted to touch me with a 10-foot pole. It was time to widen my search. Eventually, I went back to my old agency in Mobile. It was far enough away that I didn't have a trail of scandal following me, and the agency was happy to get a proven employee with big city experience. Of course, I had to sell my house in Birmingham, and even though the market there was better than many others, I got very little to show for my investment, and of course, what I got had to be shared with Carol. Carol, of course, did not disappear from our lives. She started calling Susan every week and quickly moved to Skype so they could see each other. Neither of them was content to be limited to electronic contact, but face-to-face meetings were out of the question since Carol now lived in Santa Ana, California. Apparently, our video attack on Carol had a bigger effect than we could have imagined. At job interviews, even outside the Southeast, she began to be asked questions about what had happened. She continued to look for work out west, but was never able to shake off her reputation. Eventually, she came to the conclusion that it was time to hang on to her dreams of a career as a TV presenter. She managed to get a job teaching journalism at Santa Ana College in California. The job didn't bring the pay or the joy of being an anchorwoman, but she was grateful to be working in a related field. When I finally reconnected with my old agency in Mobile, I was faced with the next task of finding a place to live. My new employer put me in touch with a real estate agency, and they assigned a new agent, Marilyn Elliott, to show me several properties. I was supposed to meet her at the first house on the list, but when I pulled up to the address, she had already overtaken me because she came to the front door as I was parking. Something about her appearance seemed strangely familiar, though the name Marilyn Elliott meant nothing to me. When I got close enough to be sure, I exclaimed in surprise, "Mrs. Stevenson." She smiled and came over to greet me. "What a pleasant surprise, Tom. When I saw your name, I thought it might be you, but I figured it was just a coincidence." "Oh, and Marilyn Elliott is my maiden name, but everyone who knows me still calls me Missy." Missy had a list of 6 houses she wanted to show me, and as we visited each one, we caught up on the events of the past few months. I hadn't realized that Missy's family lived in Mobile. She had relocated there shortly after Ted's departure. It turned out she had ventured into residential real estate as her new career path. In return, I shared my story, including my departure from the Birmingham agency and subsequent move to Mobile. When I mentioned Susan and the need to find a preschool for her, Missy became enthusiastic. "I know several places that would be perfect for her," she said. "And I'm aware of some great children's activities in the area that she'll enjoy. You'll have to introduce her to me." Then she blushed, perhaps feeling she had been too forthcoming. I welcomed any assistance that would ease Susan's transition into her new home and neighborhood. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and as the afternoon and our day of exploration came to an end, I invited Missy to join me for dinner to discuss the houses we had seen. Naturally, she agreed. I had never paid much attention to Missy before. She was 2 years behind Carol and me, so our interactions had been limited. Furthermore, when Carol was at WXY, Missy was married to Ted. However, as I listened to her over dinner, I found myself intrigued. While she had always been attractive, she lacked the glamorous aura of Carol, appearing more like the girl next door. Now, I found her not only appealing but also intelligent and easy to converse with. She was genuine, speaking with simplicity and sincerity. After spending considerable time with numerous television personalities, I found Missy's simplicity and authenticity very appealing. Our conversation returned to real estate, and Missy asked which of the houses we had seen I preferred. I mentioned several that caught my interest. Curiously, I asked her opinion on which one she would recommend. I half expected her to suggest the most expensive option, considering her commission-based profession. However, she surprised me by pointing to a description of a more modestly priced house. "Why this one?" I inquired. "Oh," she replied innocently, "that's exactly where I'd like to live." Then, realizing her slip, she blushed with embarrassment. The thought crossed her mind, that would be nice. I won't dwell on it. Missy and I eventually got married, and yes, we lived in a house she liked. I had concerns about how Susan and Missy would bond, but my worries proved unfounded. Missy had longed to start a family since her marriage to Ted, but he had resisted, fearing it would hinder his personal growth. Therefore, when she met Susan, it was love at first sight. Susan, lacking female influence in her life, took to Missy immediately. Even before our marriage, Susan began referring to her as Mom, and soon Missy reciprocated. The summer after our wedding, I decided to act on something I had contemplated for a while. The three of us flew to Los Angeles so Susan could reunite with Carol. My plan was straightforward. Susan would spend a week with Carol while Missy and I explored Los Angeles as tourists. None of us had visited before, so we were eager for the experience. At the end of the week, we would regroup and return home to Mobile. I hesitated to broach the subject with Missy. No second wife would be comfortable with her husband reconnecting with his ex-wife, especially considering everything that had transpired. However, when I tentatively raised the idea, Missy simply said, "I think that's a great idea." It seemed she was more confident than I had realized.